everybody, I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mark, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Brittany.
A really important and fluid conversation. I want to note where we are right now in terms of time. It's 11:45 a.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, and this is important because the ongoing negotiations between the United States, Ukraine, and Russia are ongoing. So let's talk about where we are. Earlier this week, Ukraine agreed to a U.S. proposed immediate 30-day ceasefire deal in the war with Russia. And a U.S. envoy arrived in Moscow today on Thursday to negotiate with Russia. And based on reporting, it isn't looking too optimistic that Russia is going to agree to this deal as is. A top aide to Putin reportedly said that the deal gives them nothing. Based on what you're hearing, based on what you're seeing from the ceasefire negotiation, what do you make of where we are right now?
Well, Brittany, that was a great summary because I think where we are is the United States has conducted a maximum pressure campaign on its ally, Ukraine, and Ukraine has buckled. They've given in on what will be a critical minerals deal for us, so some type of payback for our $150 to $170 billion that we've given Ukraine in mostly military assistance. It also, freezes in place the Russian gains, both the 2014 gains in Crimea and in the eastern Ukraine, but also some increased gains that Russia's had over the last 3 years. And in theory, it would give some vague security guarantees to Ukraine, but also, most importantly, the turn back on of U.S. information sharing, intelligence sharing, and weapon shipments. So Ukraine fully negotiated in public with the United States its position, and now we're reaching out to Russia, which obviously is a suboptimal way to negotiate with a authoritarian regime with a penchant for power.
And I think what's interesting, if you've negotiated anything in your life, whether it be personal, for a salary, anything, you know that if you're compromising to begin with before the other person has even negotiated at all, that's not a good position to be in. And we saw what was on display in the White House less than 2 weeks ago with President Trump's meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. And from there, it was really fiery, really chaotic. And after that meeting, critics labeled President Trump everything from a Putin apologist to someone who's cozying up to a dictator. Based on those characterizations, based on the negotiations that we're seeing today, what do you make of that?
So I think we have to hold our fire on that. Look, I'm disappointed with how we treated President Zelensky. I think he is a hero of our generation for the way he fought off a invasion by a Russian army 10 times the size of his country. And when confronted, asked by the Biden administration, do you want a plane to get out? He said, I don't need a plane, I need weapons. I mean, this man is a hero. However, I don't know whether we can pass judgment on President Trump till we see how he responds to Putin now. When Steve Witkoff, his negotiator going into Russia, gets what I think is likely to be a rejection of the current terms, does President Trump then do the smart thing, which is a maximum pressure campaign on Russia, the protagonist, the instigator, the invader of Ukraine? And if he does that, and he can do that through a number of methods, what weapons we give them, the restrictions on those weapons, economic sanctions, affecting oil shipments throughout China and India, a maximum pressure campaign on Russia will force Russia to come to the table as well. Because just like Vladimir Zelensky, Russia does not hold the cards either. The United States holds the cards.
Let's talk about what Putin's aide is saying, because this is what Reuters has quoted him as saying. Quote, I stated our position, meaning Russia's position, that this is nothing other than a temporary respite for the Ukrainian military, nothing more. And then he reiterated this, quote, it gives us nothing, meaning the deal. It only gives the Ukrainians an opportunity to regroup, gain strength, and to continue the same thing. Is this just tough talk from Russia as a negotiating tactic, or do you really think they're not going to get on board? They're not going to play ball?
I'm not sure. There are concessions that Russia could get and give a little enough that they would play ball. But I don't think Zelensky's in that position. In other words, if Zelensky were to agree to no foreign troops, Zelensky were to agree to no rearming, some weird election scheme in Ukraine, then I think Russia would deal. But to me, those are unacceptable concessions for Zelensky, and for Ukraine. So I do think we're very quickly going to come to a point where Russia will have to be induced to agree. And the way they're induced to agree is a maximum pressure campaign executed by the United States under the leadership of Donald Trump. If we don't do it, we're going to be left in this middle land with no agreement. If he does it, I think over time, it may take 2 or 3 months, but Russia will see how weak its hand is.
And talk to us about that a little bit more. You mentioned that with sanctions, with weapons. If you were advising the president, let's say Russia says no deal here, and you're saying, okay, President Trump, what you need to do is a maximum pressure campaign on Russia, what would you want to see?
So the first thing I would do is first, again, turn to my European partners and remind them that they are the principal suppliers of purchasers of weapons for the Ukrainians. Unfortunately, our defense industrial base is probably where they'll have to go to buy some of this stuff, but that's okay. What we're going to say is you're responsible for the security, whether you use the 300 billion in Russian funds that they've frozen, or whether they use new European money, begin to flow more European money in. Then release all the weapon systems that are flowing to Ukraine from the United States. They still have 20 billion plus dollars worth of weapon systems previously purchased that could flow to them, and give them, and then open up some new ones like more ATACMS. They're a long-range ground launch weapon, more airdropped weapons from the F-16s. Give them permissions to use those longer-range weapons at their maximum ranges inside Russia, affecting Russian troop concentrations, affecting Russian airfields. So increased weapons, fewer restrictions on the weapons to increase their likelihood of success. And then finally, a serious sanctioning campaign against Russian Russian fossil fuels, oil and natural gas. What I mean by that is we already have some sanctions on what's called the shadow fleet, but really sanction the secondary and tertiary receivers of that oil, cut off their ability to sell that. Russia is vulnerable. Their economy is driven largely by the sale of these fossil fuels. And their whole government budget is 40 to 45% for defense, 50 to 55% for buying votes from babushkas, right? Either way, if he has to cut that down, Putin's going to have real trouble. He either can't fund the war, or he can't fund the people, his supporters throughout the country. Either way, he's in real trouble. Got to cut off his access to resources from his fossil fuels.
I think what you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation is important. This is really a David and Goliath story. If you remember 3 years ago in February of 2022, no one thought Ukraine was going to last more than a couple of days. They thought Ukraine was going to fall pretty immediately. President Zelensky said, I'm not leaving. He said that video of exactly where he was. He was offered a plane out, like you said, and he said, no, I need more weapons. The Kremlin said, though, that the tides have changed now for Russia. Russia is anticipating that their military is going to take back the Kursk region. As we know, Ukraine took that over in a surprise offensive last year. Do you think this action, this changing of the tide for Russia, is impacting these talks at all?
I'm glad you pointed out, Brittany. You're absolutely right. They've captured back about 85% of the Kursk region they've lost. The Ukrainians now hold 77 square miles, which is about two District of Columbias is what they have right now. It's a very small patch of property. I think they're going to lose it. They need to exfiltrate those troops safely, get them back behind Ukrainian lines, and preserve as much of the force they can. But that does not mean Russia's won. Russia's on the front foot, but the Russian military has serious problems. They don't operate well together. They fight in what can only be described as a gruesome feeding, their soldiers, men into a meat grinder. They're losing men at an unbelievable level. They're now having to recruit. They're now having to draft Slavic, youth from the Moscow and St. Petersburg areas. This will have an impact on Putin's popularity at home, a negative impact, these losses. I think he has a problem coming with manpower in about the 2026 timeframe. So as President Trump would like to say, Vladimir Putin, you do not have the cards here. The United States can make this a painful experience for you. So get to the negotiating table with real concessions to match President Zelensky's concessions, and then we can have peace. Without that, the United States should support Ukraine in a way that eventually bends Putin to Trump's will.
To your point, no one is holding the cards here. Russia's army is facing serious problems. Ukraine made a deal of concessions before Russia was even brought to the negotiating table. Who is the winner in this deal?
Again, we won't know, Brittany, until we see how President Trump plays President Putin. You know, if I say right now, Zelensky's really laid his cards out. He's played all the concessions he can. So if he does not get equal concessions from Russia, we will not have a peace treaty or even a cessation of hostilities. So from my perspective, we do not know until President Trump plays his strongest card, a maximum pressure campaign on Russia.
I know that a lot remains to be seen here as you and I are talking, because I noted at the top of the conversation, the U.S. envoy is in Russia right now. They're negotiating with Russia. What specifically are you looking out for next?
A readout from that meeting, and a readout both of the Russian version and the American readout, because they could be somewhat different. And then President Trump's reaction. He's already hinted he could use sanctions to hurt Putin. He's already turned the spigot back on for intelligence sharing and for weapon system flow. So Vladimir Putin's got to know he's got risk here. So let's see what happens at the end of this meeting.
Mark Montgomery, I always appreciate our conversations. I appreciate your insight, your expertise. You are welcome back anytime, and I specifically hope that you come back as we see more of these negotiations fleshed out. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me, Brittany. Great to be with you.